All right. So the notes for Song of Solomon apparently have already been passed out, which is fine. That's fine. We may or may not get to them tonight. The reason why we're skipping Ecclesiastes for the moment to go to Song of Solomon is that I'm not sure how long the Ecclesiastes study is going to take. And so for Job, I wanted to kind of go chapter by chapter for the first few chapters of Job and kind of get a exegetical study out of that, and then kind of to move to the end of Job, and then with Psalms, that was kind of an overview looking at a couple of different Psalms, and now Proverbs, because these books are so many chapters, it doesn't make a lot of sense to go chapter by chapter by chapter in Proverbs. But Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes are so short in terms of chapters that I kind of want to do a little bit more time in those, and especially Ecclesiastes, because a lot of times Ecclesiastes gets sometimes it gets a bad rap because people sometimes they'll do a cursory reading of it and they'll think it's so depressing, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. What's the point of anything? When in fact it's actually the opposite. It's a very encouraging letter of wisdom, so to speak. So as soon as we're done with Proverbs, we are going to go to Song of Solomon, cover that one, and then go to Ecclesiastes. And I know that there have been several who have been asking if we were going to get through Song of Solomon before January 1st, which is the new quarter where some of our teachers are going to be in classes. So I figured, because I don't know how long Ecclesiastes is going to take, I think we'll be close to done by the end of December, but I'm not entirely certain. So we'll do Song of Solomon and then Ecclesiastes after that. All right. So we are looking at the Proverbs notes, and again, this is kind of an overview. We've looked at some of the Proverbs going from Proverbs 25, Proverbs chapter 3, Proverbs chapter 10. We've noted how that Peter, for the most part, is the main writer in the New Testament that quotes from the Proverbs. Last week we ended looking at 1 Peter chapter 4. And so that's where we're going to pick up this evening. 1 Peter chapter 4, and in verse 8, we talked about the love covering a multitude of sins. We discussed that connection as well in James, and the description of that concept that we looked at the context of that proverb and noted that this isn't hiding sin, because that term cover means to hide or to put away. It's not the same term as forgive, and it's not the same term as to make up for. That's not the concept. And so we talked about the fact that it's not that there's and we talked Sunday about profit and loss. Okay, it's not that I can that having characteristics of love will somehow outweigh my whatever sins I may commit. In fact, it has more to do with the character. If I'm focused on love and I'm focused on the works that God would have me to be involved in, the type of mindset and character, then my thought process isn't going to be attributing itself to sinful things. I'm not going to be thinking about as much of temptation and so forth. I'm going to be focused on works of love for God, love for my brethren, love for my neighbor, and as a result, that's going to hide those other characteristics within me that tend to be more selfish. Okay, because all of us have a selfish side. Nobody is completely selfless. All of us have parts within us, those dark sides of us, that can be selfish if it wants to. And of course, the whole point of being Christians is to put away those, or to hide those, cover those dark sides of us, and emphasize the good sides, the sides that God has taught us to be. And so that's what. That's why both James and Peter quote, it seems, especially with James. It's not in quotations or anything, but it does seem as he's referencing that proverb. So before we go on to verse 18, any thoughts through love covering a multitude of sins? I know that gets talked about a lot, and people wonder what that means. And I believe that what I just described, I think that fits with the concepts and in harmony with the rest of the scriptures. It isn't a profit loss type of thing. That the hiding or the covering of that dark side of us is what it's describing. All right. So, as 1 Peter chapter 4, he describes this need for these brethren to be willing to suffer. Notice he says, don't think it strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you, verse 12. The tense in which he uses this in the Greek suggests that there's a specific either period of time or a specific obstacle that is coming that is going to be even more than what they've already faced. There's going to be something specific coming down the line here that they're going to face that is going to completely put them to the test more than any other persecution that they've faced. And he wants them to be strong through that. So when we get to verse 17, well, no, it's verse 16. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God, and if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? Now if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? Therefore let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good as to a faithful Creator. So as Peter is concluding this particular thought, chapter 5, he's going to pick up with shepherds, elders. So as he's concluding this particular thought about being willing to submit to the will of God, being willing to yield my will and my very natural, very human sense of self-preservation, being willing to yield that to suffer for the cause of Christ, if that's what it means. He brings out the point, the time has come for judgment to begin. And when he says judgment, it's not necessarily the idea of present day judgment. Okay, he's describing the ultimate judgment day. That's what he's describing. Because he brings out, well, if the specific judgment, if it's going to affect the house of God and it starts there and then it narrows further out, then where will the ungodly appear? And that's his point, is about judgment day. So when he says, for the time has come, it's this sense in which we're in these last days. Okay, just because 2,000 years later after Peter wrote 1 Peter 4, that doesn't mean Peter was mistaken. Peter's not describing, hey, it's going to happen next week or next year. Okay, we're in this last age, that we're in the last dispensation. God's not going to dispense any more revelations, any more of his will. Everything's been given to us. The time has come. This is it. This is the final time. Judgment's going to start with the house of God. And I think that's an interesting little kind of piece of information that you kind of throw in with everything else we know about when Christ returns and when the judgment day comes. The way Peter describes this, it's going to start with God's people. Okay, it's going to start there because, and this is something that is repeated, or something that Jesus brought out himself when he described how that, Matthew chapter 7, for instance, many will say to me in that day, there are going to be religious people who thought they were serving God, but were not submitting to the will of God. They're going to be lost. Okay, some of those who did not submit to the will of God, they're going to be lost. So even members even of the house of God who aren't living the way that they should, okay, that standard is going to be held to them. And notice the implication that Peter's bringing out. That same standard, if even some Christians aren't going to meet that standard because they're not living properly, then where are the ungodly where are they going to end up? And that's kind of stressing that point. So when he says, if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? He quotes from Proverbs, if the righteous one is scarcely saved. He's not saying that if we obey the gospel the way God wants us to and we're doing everything we're supposed to, that there's a chance we could still be lost. That's not what Peter's saying. The point is that those who consider themselves righteous, okay, it's not from God's perspective, well, you're righteous, but I'm still going to condemn you anyway. It's from our perspective. And then that's what Proverbs is speaking to, that's what Peter's speaking to. If the righteous one is scarcely saved, okay, that there are many people who may appear righteous when in fact there may be things happening in secret that we don't know anything about, but God knows. And so if these individuals who may seem righteous, even some of them are not going to be saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good as to a faithful Creator. And the way Peter describes, and the way the rest of the New Testament describes the willingness to endure persecution. Persecution is the ultimate test of our faith. And if we're willing to yield ourselves to be beaten, to be hurt, to be even killed, then we should be willing to give ourselves over to doing what is right. Not just not doing what is bad, but to doing what is right. And that's what verse 19 kind of describes. Let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls. Okay, if you're willing to suffer, then commit your soul to God in doing good. All right? It's not enough just to not do bad. You have to do good also, as to a faithful Creator. And this is coming when Peter quotes this here in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 18. It's coming from Proverbs chapter 11. And in verse 31, and again, I mentioned before that looking at context isn't particularly effective necessarily with Proverbs. There are occasions where we noticed with the love hides a multitude of sins or covers a multitude of sins, that kind of helps a little bit looking at context. But here in Proverbs chapter 11, and notice starting in verse 30, verse 29, he who troubles his own house will inherit the wind, and the fool will be servant to the wise of heart. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who wins souls is wise. If the righteous will be recompensed on the earth, how much more the ungodly and the sinner? That recompensed, sometimes recompense can be a positive, could be a good thing in the sense of payment or reward. This is not what that means. Recompensed is judgment. If the righteous will be recompensed on the earth, how much more the ungodly and the sinner? And that's why Peter quotes this, describing that if judgment starts with us, with the righteous, and that's why he quotes, the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? All right, any thoughts through 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 18? Yes, ma'am.
We think that means physical suffering, but a lot of our suffering today is going to be more in the way of our relationships with others.
Yeah, emotional.
What people say about us that's not true.
Yeah.
They might call you a goody two-shoes or holier than thou, but when people assault you, make accusations against you, and you love them anyway, they begin to see the light that you're true to your word. If your yes is yes and you stand for God, you will suffer persecution.
Yeah.
Even though it's not being stoned or beaten or anything like that. But if you're standing up for God amongst the world in a business environment, unless you own that business, you will suffer some kind of persecution.
Yeah, and a lot of it, when we talk about mental or emotional persecution or distress, especially in our society where not just God, but characteristics that God wants us to employ, wants us to have, the way in which we live, the manner that we either act or don't act, speak or don't speak. A lot of times those characteristics, even outside of a religious context, those characteristics can be condemned by the world simply because the world can recognize those characteristics as being good characteristics. And knowing that they don't have those or maybe don't work on those the way that they should, they can persecute us even outside of a religious context, even if it doesn't have anything to do with God specifically. It just has those characteristics that God wants us to have. In our society, the idea of hate speech, the idea of judgment, even not necessarily by word, just by action or inaction for that matter, can affect us even outside of religious context. So absolutely, the persecution that we face today is, not to say it's any easier than physical persecution. In some ways, especially given I guess you could say the immediate nature of physical persecution. In some ways, you could argue that the continual, over the long term, emotional and mental persecution can sometimes even be worse, depending on our situation, depending on maybe what relationships we're in, depending on what kind of job we have. Sometimes you might think, I just wish, they'd beat me and get it over with. Or kill me and get it over with, instead of this drawn-out, long-term, repeatedly beating down on our character, on our thoughts. And so sometimes it can be just as bad, just as trying as physical persecution. Ben?
I don't even think it always has to be directly either. I think disassociate with you because you don't go drink with them or something.
You're not like them.
Yeah. They don't necessarily intentionally do it.
Right.
And maybe some people do. If you're in the workplace and you don't go have a beer with them after work, then you don't get the promotion, or
Yeah.
And it's nothing real direct.
Right.
But you still suffer for it.
Right. Absolutely.
You might be more qualified, but you're not buddy with
Yeah.
your boss or whatever because of the things you won't do.
Absolutely. And there are occasions, and I know of Christians who have dealt with things like that, where you're supposed to be kind of dealing with clients and dealing with other managers and stuff like that. And there have been times where Christians have faced the decision, I've been told by my boss to take these clients out for a ball game, but it means I'm going to be missing services on Sunday, because it's going to be an all-day thing. And they're having to face the option of either missing services for their, taking their clients out, and knowing full well those clients are going to be, wanting alcohol and all this stuff. And it's a hard position to be put in. And unfortunately, there's not enough of employers, not enough on our business side that value an individual who has integrity as a Christian. And that's unfortunate. There used to be a time when employers seemed to value a characteristic of an individual who was religious, because with that religion, generally speaking, also came dependability, reliability, someone who was honest, someone who worked hard, someone who was willing to tell the truth. That all of that kind of came with it. But a lot of times in our society, instead of religion being a positive attribute, I guess you could say, for our workplace, it can be a negative one in many ways. Yeah. All right. Anything else through 1 Peter 4:18? All right. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 22. Second Peter 2, starting in verse 18. And this is as Peter is describing false teachers that are going to be coming, convincing brethren, telling them things they want to hear. That's what when he says in verse 18, these swelling words of emptiness. But they're going to have an appearance of religion. It's going to have an appearance of godliness, so to speak. Verse 18, for when they speak great swelling words of emptiness, they allure through the lusts of the flesh, through lewdness, the ones who have actually escaped from those who live in error. While they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. For by whom a person is overcome, by him also he is brought into bondage. For if after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and they are again entangled in them and overcome, the latter end is worse for them than the beginning. And the specific teaching that Peter seems to be dealing with was this sense in which you can live the way you want to, this very, not libertarian, libertine. I made the mistake one time in a lesson, I said libertarian, and I had a couple people say, no, libertarian is a political point of view. It's not the same thing. Libertinism, this idea of liberty and how I live, I can do what I want, when I want, with my body. And the basis of it is that since God has forgiven us of all sins, we can no longer sin no longer has an impact on us. It's very connected to Romans chapter 6, verse 1. Shall we continue to sin that grace may abound? And so Peter's dealing with this teaching that is trying to convince Christians, hey, the more you sin, the more God's grace abounds upon you. So you know what? They're promising them, notice Peter says there in verse 19, they promise them liberty. You can be free. There are no more restrictions. There is no more law. You can live as you want. And Peter says the worse, or the end is worse for them than the beginning. For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it, to turn away from the holy commandment delivered to them. He's not saying that hell's going to be any hotter for Christians who fall away. Peter's not describing some scale of judgment. What he's saying is that for all eternity, that individual is going to have to deal with knowing that they had the truth. They were in the position that they should have been in, but then they allowed themselves to be carried off into sin again. And that's what his point is. It's not that there's some level of hell that Christians who fall away are in like the 10th level of hell, whereas people who never obeyed the truth are in the 5th level of hell. This isn't a scalability of judgment. It has everything to do with the fact that for eternity, I'm going to have to deal with that, knowing I shouldn't have to be here. I could have done what God wanted me to do, but instead, I allowed that to slip away. And now I have eternity to have to dwell on it. And that definitely would be worse. Absolutely. So verse 22 is where Peter quotes from Proverbs. But it happened to them according to the true proverb. A dog returns to his own vomit, and a sow having washed in her wallowing, and a sow having washed to her wallowing in the mire. And he ends with that thought process. And it's based on verse 21, that the end is worse than the beginning. And so when he quotes this, and this is why he uses this, because it fits so well with his point. Proverbs 26, and in verse 9, start in verse 9. Like a thorn that goes into the hand of a drunkard is a proverb in the mouth of fools, because it doesn't mean anything. They don't get it. They don't have the wisdom to really think it through and apply it. The great God who formed everything gives the fool his hire and the transgressor his wages. As a dog returns to his own vomit, so a fool repeats his folly. Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. So notice as this proverb brings out God, verse 10. He gives the fool his hire, the transgressor who his wages. They have their opportunities. But notice as a dog, what they're going to use with those opportunities, it's going to come back around. They're just going to do the same thing over and over and over again. And that's why he kind of starts this with, like a thorn that goes in the hand of a drunkard. So is a proverb. A drunkard, do drunkards, people who are completely drunk, do they really feel anything? So if you had a thorn that you're putting your hand in a bush or something, you hit a thorn. As a drunkard, are you really going to feel it? Not really. But is it still going to, is it going to be any good for you? No. He says, so like a thorn that goes into the hand of a drunkard, so is the proverb of mouth of fools. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to help them. There's not going to be anything that's going to, they're not even going to notice it because they're so numb. And that's the way he describes fools. They're kind of numb of mind, that this isn't going to do anything for them, which then leads to verse 11. As a dog returns to his own vomit, so a fool repeats his folly over and over and over again. Let's see, I don't know if I'm going to be able to quote it properly, but was it Albert Einstein that said that in something to the effect that insanity is kind of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? Okay, and that kind of makes what I think about when I think about this proverb in verse 11. Go ahead, Lisa.
I was just going to say, it's my understanding that drunk people don't feel pain. It's my understanding of that. So the drunkard's going to pull the thorn out, but he's not going to remember how he got it. So
Yeah.
he's going to keep sticking his hand wherever the thorn was and pull him out and say, oh, I've got a sore spot.
Yeah.
But he keeps going back. He keeps, as it says later, he keeps repeating the same behavior.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, and that puts the thorn into the hand of the drunkard. It fits that context because the understanding, verse 10 kind of links the two together. The great God who formed everything gives the fool his hire and his transgressor. God allows them to be fools. God allows the transgressor to have his wages. God also allows them to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And that's the point. All right, yes, ma'am.
Well, I think too, the passage we were studying earlier about it would be better for him, than having to not know. I think we've all experienced regret. And there's a huge difference between I wished I had known and I knew and I didn't take advantage.
Yep.
So you think about hell is hell, but now you have this piece laid on top of it where you knew better and you didn't do better.
Yeah.
So it's going to be the same spiritual pain, but you're going to have the added psychological, if there's even that in heaven,
Yeah.
pain of knowing that you could have chosen differently.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. And so then notice that application of the proverb then in the text of 2 Peter. Okay? So it happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to his own vomit. So in essence, what is Peter saying about Christians who allow themselves to be overcome and taken off into sin? What's he saying? I mean, in the quote itself from Proverbs, so a fool repeats his folly. Well, you knew better. You escaped the world of lust in Christ Jesus. You escaped from that through him. And now you're going right back to it. But this time you feel justified because somebody told you, hey, it's okay. You can do this and still be holy and still be godly and righteous. Okay. And in essence, Peter's saying, you're like a fool that keeps repeating the same problem over and over and over again. That's what, in essence, Peter's saying about these brethren who are falling away back to what they escaped from to start with. Yes, ma'am.
Well, and if you look at those, both of those have a physical component, and that's usually where Christians get tripped up is, you know, when I have dogs, they do go back to their own vomit.
Yeah.
Make them not, you know. And pigs don't really care that much about being clean. I know they're tidy animals, but it's their way to cool off. So they're, in both of those scenarios, they are fulfilling a desire of the flesh.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a sense, especially that first one, that emits a why would you do that reaction. Why, you know, a dog that returns to his own vomit, that's disgusting. Why would you do that? You know, but that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point that Peter's making. Why would a Christian do this? A sow having washed, and I love the imagery here, people who are washed in the blood of Jesus are made clean from the blemishes of sin. So then why would you go back and wallow in a mire and get dirty again? The imagery fits perfectly. And that's why Peter uses Proverbs to describe that idea.
Because it feels good.
Because it feels good.
A fool doesn't knows what clean is.
Right.
Like sow doesn't know what's clean.
Well,
It is. I see them go through the show and they're all cleaned up. They don't care
yeah,
if they're clean or not.
yeah. Well, and a lot of this, a dog,
That's how the fool is. I don't care if
yeah.
they're clean or not.
Well, and in a lot of ways, a dog and a sow, the things that they do by instinct, right? It's the innate instinct of them. And as human beings, is there a physical side of us that is very instinctual, very primal? Absolutely. But the challenge and certainly the call that God makes to mankind is to overcome. This is what separates us from animals, is that we have the ability to overcome our natural instincts for things and instead set ourselves to something else. Okay, we can overcome our natural instincts. And this is, in essence, we become exactly the way we were. We're trained in our instincts. When we go back to this, we're just doing the same thing over and over again. Whereas God calls us to overcome our instincts and to maintain a path that is informed by the mind, not by instinct. Yes, ma'am.
And that's really the one thing that he requested of us, deny yourself and follow me.
Yeah.
And that's usually where we all get tripped up.
Yep.
In denying our own whatever it is.
And especially when it's painted as if it could be right, it could be holy. And I think that's where Satan has his perhaps biggest effect on Christians. It's not so much the fact that, well, here's sin, you know, just come on back. You know, a lot of Christians are going to, no, I'm not doing that. But if he were to paint it in a different picture, paint it as holy or godly, in some form or fashion, twisting the scriptures to make it justifiable, you know, to make it to kind of give a person a sense that I'll be okay, I'll still be right with God even if I do this. That's where kind of the danger lies. It's in that trap that Satan can lay in making things look better. But in fact, this really is kind of just painted in a different picture. All right, anything through 2 Peter 2 and Proverbs 11 that we talked about? Yes, sir.
Since we're in the book of Proverbs and more so looking at it, a major theme of that book is wisdom versus folly.
Yeah.
And this fool is returning to his folly. So wisdom comes in knowing not to do that.
Right. And
you've escaped, stay away from it.
Absolutely. And of course, you know, Solomon never calls a fool someone who makes a mistake but then learns from it. In fact, that's wisdom, isn't it? Wisdom is the application of knowledge. Well, now I've learned that this is not the way I should do things, this isn't the way I should live, this isn't the way I should think, and I'm going to make changes to address that. That's the definition of wisdom. So yeah, absolutely, kind of the constant contrast between the wicked and the righteous, the fool or folly and wisdom or the wise. It's that constant difference between the two that is kind of what Solomon deals with and what King Lemuel deals with and Agur deals with. All right, anything else through this text? All right, there is one more I kind of want to mention. There's a parable that is almost identical in language that Jesus uses in Luke chapter 14 and in verse 10. And it seems like there may be some reference here in Proverbs 25, verses 6 and 7. And so real quickly, we'll take a look at this. Proverbs 25. All right, so these also are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter. As the heavens for height and the earth for depth, so the heart of kings is unsearchable. Take away the dross from silver, and it will go to the silversmith for jewelry. Take away the wicked from before the king. His throne will be established in righteousness. Do not exalt yourself in the presence of the king, and do not stand in the place of the great. For it is better that he say to you, come up here, than that you should be put lower in the presence of the prince whom your eyes have seen. So as Solomon is kind of describing the relationship between a king and servants and the idea of what is valuable to a king, notice he says, take away the wicked from before the king. His throne will be established in righteousness. Especially from a wisdom perspective, is it better for a king to have fools and wicked individuals advising him and kind of whispering in his ear, or to have righteous and holy people? And should he lend any kind of adherence to what these wicked people say? That's why he says his throne will be established in righteousness if he doesn't allow these individuals before his throne. Do not exalt yourself in the presence of the king. Do not stand in the place of the great. For it is better that he say to you, come up here, than that you should be put lower in the presence of the prince. Humility. Recognizing authority, recognizing the need to maintain that authority. So when we consider what Jesus says back in Luke chapter 14, notice with me starting in verse 7. So he told a parable to those who were invited when he noted how they chose the best places, saying to them, when you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. He who invited you and him come and say to you, give place to this man. And then you begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, go up higher. Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted. The sense in which the teaching, the wisdom involved is exactly the same. The language is extremely similar. The imagery is different. Whereas in Proverbs you have the king and servant of the king or an officer of the court, as opposed to this wedding feast that Jesus describes. This is and notice this is all based on, he told a parable to those who were invited when he noted how they chose the best places. They needed a lesson on humility and on recognizing, don't exalt yourself. Okay, let the authority exalt you. And that's exactly what Solomon deals with in Proverbs chapter 25. It's not exactly the same language. And of course, the base here is wisdom that is applied across the board. Patriarchal law, old law, new law. Doesn't make any difference. But it's interesting to me that there's such a similarity in the things that Jesus says with different imagery, but it's the exact same teaching as what Solomon said in Proverbs 25. So I figured I'd just throw that out there. Again, I don't think it's not a quote, obviously, but there is certainly a relationship there between those two texts showing the same teaching. Is you let the higher authority exalt you, don't exalt yourself. And of course, in context to this, the point of Jesus' teaching is, let God exalt you. Okay, let God exalt you. You don't exalt yourself. All right, anything through that? Okay, let's see if we can how far we're not going to quite get all the way through, but we'll be able to finish up to the point where we will start Song of Solomon next week. Okay. Oh, man, that's small. Oh, boy. Okay, well. All right, so we noticed already that the purpose of the book of Proverbs is to teach wisdom. There's some wisdom that can only be learned by experience. There's certain types of wisdom that you just kind of have to go through. Being a parent, you can read all the books you want, but that's not necessarily, I mean, it'll prepare you for some of the occasions you might face, but in terms of the mentality and the day-by-day stuff, that's something you kind of just have to learn as you go and grow into. But the wisest of us take note of those who make mistakes or endure hardships and utilize those lessons without having to personally go through those situations. That's one of the things that Solomon really emphasizes, is take note of the people who make these mistakes. Take note, learn the lessons of fools. Don't be like them. Proverbs is meant by Solomon to be a book that can help prevent mistakes and help people to understand the wisdom we should have in our life. And really adding on to that, to learn from our past mistakes, don't continue to do them, as we've already talked about. Some lessons to be learned, and these are both from within the text, but also in context of the life of Solomon as well. Just because someone is wise doesn't mean they're perfect. As human beings, we often admire those who are wise and experienced, but we must be careful to not lose sight of what is right, as those who are wise do not always do what is right, as in Solomon's case. For someone so wise and had such a gift from God, multiple gifts for that matter, not just the wisdom, but the riches and the glory and so forth that Solomon had, to allow himself, and it was gradual, it didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual thing in which he constantly and consistently married these women from other countries who had other gods, and he allowed them to keep those gods, and then gradually they led his heart astray for a period of time. Okay, and so certainly Solomon was not, just because someone's extremely wise, doesn't mean they're immune to making mistakes. Okay, elders who are designed to be the wisest, hopefully, of us, even elders sometimes don't always make the best choices, and they'll be the first to admit that. Sometimes they go back looking through decisions they make, and they say, well, we probably could have handled that a little bit better, could have done it this way rather than that way, and it could have turned out a little bit better. Okay, so wisdom doesn't necessarily mean immune to mistakes. All right, we will stop there with some lessons to be learned. We'll pick up with that. And again, the notes are on the back table for Song of Solomon. If you want one of those, pick those up. They're right above the Proverbs notes. Thank you, everybody, for thoughts and comments.